but I'll go ahead and get things started. So welcome everyone to this month's edition of Water Data Forum. I'm Max Herzog, a program manager with Cleveland Water Alliance, one of the partners behind Water Data Forum. This month's session is part of a year-long series curated by us at CWA, our partners at the Midwest Big Data Innovation Hub, and the Water Environment Federation, or WEF. Each month is going to kind of engage a cross-sector panel of experts on a different topic in the realm of water data. Today, we're going to be focusing on cultivating regional resilience, the story of water data and climate challenges at scale. I'm really excited to dive into the conversation today. Before we do, though, I want to do just a little bit of housekeeping. Throughout the session, you will be able to submit your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You should have also access to a chat, but please do submit your questions to the Q&A so we can tease them out from any in the chat. If you have any technical difficulties throughout, feel free to post in the chat or directly message myself or Samantha Martin. CWA will be doing technical support, so we'll be keeping an eye on the chat throughout. Yeah, and just really encourage you to submit questions. We're going to leave some time at the end for kind of that Q&A section, and really excited to hear how you want to engage with our speakers. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Derek Konekis. Dr. Konekis is an associate research faculty in the Division of Earth and Ecosystem Sciences at the Desert Research Institute. He holds a PhD of Public Policy from Indiana University, Bloomington, and an MS from the University of California, Davis. His research focuses on regional environmental governance and the emergence of cooperative institutions. He's examined behavioral and institutional components of resilience planning, local climate policy networks, and the role of technology in the management of natural systems. Dr. Konekis currently serves, as an advisory committee member for the Department of Homeland Security's Resilient Investment Planning and Development Working Group, and on the advisory group on professional education for the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. So we're very excited to have Dr. Konekis as our guest facilitator for the day, and I will hand it off to him to facilitate the rest of this session. Dr. Konekis.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining our session. We appreciate it. We have a great panel of experts here today, and we're going to go ahead and organize this panel around how do we think about data systems for looking at climate change and regional resilience. So what we're going to start with is a very brief introduction to each of our panelists and how the work, oh, there it is. I was hoping we would have one of those, and how their work relates to the larger questions that we want to address here. We want to make this as interactive as possible, so do feel free to pop questions up into the question box whenever you have the opportunity. If anything pops up, we'll make sure we get to it that way. So to begin some introductions, I'd like each of our panelists just discuss very broadly how their work connects to large-scale data systems for developing regional resilience. And I'll start it off. I'll take this one opportunity for me to speak a little bit about my own work. So as I look out on the landscape of emerging data systems for water around the country, what we're often seeing is two sectors dominating, utilities and agriculture, and an increasing move toward proprietary systems. A lot of the instrumentation deployment has been very opportunistic, so it tends not to be very broadly coordinated. These are often driven by funding opportunities and local political jurisdictions with very little attention to cross-jurisdictional coordination. If we continue on our current trajectory around large-scale data systems, it's likely to be highly fragmented, very proprietary, very little attention to strategic needs happening at the watershed or the water system scale. And typically, as we see in a lot of public policy areas, developed as a reaction to crisis rather than anticipatory and looking at future needs. My work looks at identifying bottoms-up demands for data systems. So a lot of the work I'm doing is looking at kind of hidden users out there that we don't think about in terms of today's landscape of data users. the mechanisms that allow for greater cross-jurisdictional coordination. How do we build new PPNPs, so public-private nonprofit partnerships? Having the environmental sector there and nonprofit is a critical part of a lot of these systems, and then matching governance at watershed scales. So you can kind of think of me as the soft infrastructure that makes these systems work in terms of cooperation. I'm going to go, I'll call names just for introductions to make sure that we can get everybody in on time. And I'll start with Dr. Grace Wilson, postdoctoral researcher at the University of Minnesota. And to repeat the question, how does your work connect to the emergence of large-scale data systems for water for regional resilience?
Yeah, so my name is Grace Wilson. I work at the University of Minnesota. A lot of my work has to do with using data to understand management practices on water quality, specifically in agricultural watersheds. Some of this is actual like field measurements of changing management practices to see what the water quality impacts are and actually measuring in the field what's going on there. But oftentimes it is utilizing hydrologic and water quality models to make predictions about what future climate scenarios or different management practices are going to have on water quality, and really using key input data to populate the models and try to have realistic predictions of what's going to happen there. So using data both just to understand on a sort of a field scale, measuring what impacts different management practices have, but also utilizing much larger scale data to populate these hydrologic models on either field scale or much larger watershed scales.
Fantastic, thank you, Grace. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Chris Jones. Again, just to repeat, talk about your work and how it connects to larger scale systems for water resilience at the regional level.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. So in Iowa here, we have our Iowa nutrient reduction strategy, and several other states in the Mississippi Basin also have a similar thing, a similar policy tool. And ours here helps fund the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, which is located at Iowa State University, but approximately a third of that funding comes to the University of Iowa. And that funds a program I manage, which is the Iowa Water Quality Information System. We have water quality sensors deployed at about 70 sites around the state of Iowa. These are measuring water quality continuously, mainly in streams, but also some practices that have been implemented on the landscape. We have some instruments in a saturated buffer in southwest Iowa. We are monitoring the inlet and outlet of a constructed wetland in northeast Iowa, and a bioreactor set up in north central Iowa. And so all that's helping inform how well these practices are performing. And then we also have instruments at the bottom of several of our larger Huck 8 watersheds to quantify the export of nitrate from the state as a whole, and to try to determine whether or not these policies are, helping improve water quality in Iowa. And then finally, I'm part of a project funded through the national or through the big data, Midwest Big Data Hub at the University of Illinois, funded through the National Science Foundation to sort of expand this concept of the Iowa Water Quality Information System to the upper Mississippi River Basin. And so that's what we call the Upper Mississippi Information System. And so that tool is still being constructed by the researchers here at the University of Iowa and the University of Illinois.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. So next we'll hear from Dr. David Mulla, and keep the questions flowing in. We have some coming in already. We'll deal with those at the end, toward the last half of the session. Go ahead, David.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is David Mulla. I'm the Larson Chair and Professor for Soil and Water Resources in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate at the University of Minnesota. And I'm also the director of the Precision Agriculture Center. And my work is very much involved with the connections between agricultural land and agricultural land management and water, both from the point of view of hydrology impacts and water quality impacts. And I was very much involved in the Minnesota's nutrient reduction strategy. And we outlined 4 different approaches for helping to reach our nutrient reduction goals, which include better nutrient management of fertilizer and manure, better erosion control practices, better treatment of water that leaves fields through engineering practices like bioreactors, and finally, increasing the perenniality and diversity of vegetation on the landscape. And we have field trials in all of those areas to test out those management practices and estimate their suitability and their benefits to water quality. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And then Brent Dazzle, Dr. Dazzle, please.
Hey everybody. Yeah, I'm Brent Dazzle. I'm a research soil scientist with the USDA ARS in St. Paul, Minnesota. Up here in the Soil and Water Management Research Unit, we broadly focus on finding ways to do more with the working agricultural lands we have, while also improving the environmental quality of the surrounding landscape. A lot of the work I do overlaps with the things that Grace and Chris and David mentioned previously. I spent a lot of time thinking about how do streams and rivers reflect what's happening in the working lands upstream from them, and then how can we tailor the management practices on those working lands to improve water quality in those streams and rivers. I do that with a lot of watershed scale modeling, evaluating different conservation practices and trying to identify not only which ones are most effective, but also where in the landscapes can they be effective and at what times do they provide the greatest benefit, maybe from a seasonal standpoint or a interannual standpoint. I also spend a lot of time sharing results from that work with other scientists, people who focus more on in-channel network processes, maybe additional sources of sediment nutrients that we don't necessarily associate with processes that are happening at farm fields, but things like stream banks, and also economists to help kind of put price tags on those prescribed management practices. And then finally, USDA, thinking about big data, they have LTAR, the Long-Term Agricultural Research Network, where they are implementing a lot of, I guess, aspirational conservation management practices and business as usual practices at a variety of sites in croplands and rangelands across the country, and with the goal of coming up with, I guess, robust solutions for water quality or environmental quality. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Brett. So I'm gonna let the panelists kind of open-ended address the next question. So how does climate change impact either the potential or the challenges of developing these systems into the future? One thing that I'll just kind of see from a policy perspective is much of our policy is very reactionary, tends not to be very anticipatory. We've expanded quite well into non-point source pollution, but we're not looking at extreme sporadic events and how those might nutrient load or color what they're doing.
Okay, well, maybe I'll just start out. I wonder if it might be possible to share my screen just for a second.
You should be able to.
Okay. So we're working on a project to understand the impacts of erosion at the field scale on water quality. And what I'm showing on the screen is an output from our daily erosion project model, which takes daily rainfall and estimates soil loss based on the land use patterns in the state and the management of those lands. And we're interested in, understanding not only how hotspots occur and how we can better manage those, but also how future climate change might affect these changes in soil loss that are occurring across the state. So we're interested in evaluating alternative land uses, so different than the existing baseline corn and soybeans or wheat and soybeans, depending on where we are in the state of Minnesota. And looking at, for instance, alfalfa or perennial grains like kernza, which are very deep rooted and hold the soil, or even we're looking at cover crops to see how those might make the landscapes more resilient to climate change.
Great.
So that's my contribution.
Thank you, David. Well, what are the hotspots that we're seeing there? Can you just explain briefly what's driving those?
Yeah, those hotspots are really areas that have high precipitation and are in a row crop agriculture. So that central area is very vulnerable because of an extremely high and localized rainstorm on vulnerable lands.
Great, thank you. Other panelists?
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Well, I would say, here in Iowa, we have a lot of constructed drainage. I've heard some estimates. We have over 2 million miles of drainage tile here. And so especially in areas of the state north of I-80, which is about 2/3 of Iowa. And so, it is getting wetter here. There's just no doubt about that. We know, our primary water quality issue here is with nitrate nitrogen. It's very the levels in our streams are really transport limited. And so the more water we put through the system, the more nitrate gets in the streams and more gets down to the Gulf and the bigger the dead zone is. And so, how do we deal with this? Well, farmers deal with it by putting in more tile, right? It gets wetter. They want to dry out that soil in the spring, especially right now, so they can get the corn planted as early as possible. And so banks will lend money for tile. And so we see a lot of new tiling in Iowa. And this is, very likely connected to increasing transport of nitrate to our streams. And so in the context of climate change, I mean, that's what we're dealing with here. We have a water soluble pollutant, we have more rain, and we have more tile. And so we have this cycle here, this spiral that's really hard for us to escape out of. And so, how can data inform this, I guess, would be the question here today. And so, again, we're trying to do that by, accumulating and aggregating as much data as possible to try to show how these climate changes are going to manifest themselves going forward in our production system.
Great, thank you, Chris. Are others want to speak on the topic briefly?
Yeah, I'll just add quickly that, so, across much of the upper Midwest, certainly in Minnesota, climate change is expected to bring more moisture in our non-growing months. And so farmers are responding in the ways that Chris just described by draining their fields. And the, one of the, I guess, more promising management practices are the things like they've described in terms of trying to come up with ways of perennializing sensitive portions of the landscape, or increasing an adoption of cover crops. One of the challenges for that is, there can be the occasional dry year where those cover crops or those non-growing season type crops can deplenish or deplete soil moisture, and so that can cause challenges for the following year's cash crop. So I guess maybe to get back to kind of the broader challenge is teasing out, what are the short-term signals from interannual weather variability, and then how do we balance that to guide our decision making over this bigger imprint of climate change that's happening.
Thank you. Grace, did you want to add a bit on your own modeling work?
Yeah, I was going to say that, with climate change in particular, we're talking about future things that aren't necessarily happening right now. And really the importance of being able to utilize these water quality or hydrologic models to make predictions about what we might expect in the future. And in the context of increasing resilience, to me at least, part of what resilience means is the ability to manage for the change. So to be able to have some kind of a idea of what you might be expecting and what the best management practices are to continue to achieve your goals. So like in agricultural areas, continue to be able to produce high amounts of food, whether that means more drought or more flooding or just more variable precipitation. And really the importance of utilizing models for that. And I would say that, to have a good model output, you need to have good model inputs. And there has been this increase in the ability to put out more instrumentation, cheaper instrumentation, more sort of do-it-yourself kind of things. So you can get a lot more data that is spatially representing the areas that you're trying to model or simulate, but that there is still a fair bit of uncertainty in that data, both spatially, especially things like soil parameters just vary a ton over a short period or over a short distance. And then still having that issue of variability with time as well. So the importance of being able to try to start thinking about and quantifying and how to take into consideration some of those uncertainties in your inputs in your model to know how they're affecting the output and better put the results of your modeling results into having some sort of uncertainty or understanding how that affects them better.
Great, thank you. And I'll add just a bit to kind of pull together some of the threads here. From a public policy perspective, one of the potentials of data and technology, especially stuff Grace is talking about microinstrumentation, even citizen science or farmer scientist sort of stuff, is we can start connecting incentive systems better. I mean, the reason, Chris has outlined really quite well, the incentive to farmers is to get water off the field as quick as possible. And those misalignment of incentives are much of what's driving our water quality problems at these large scales. So if we could actually incentivize that downscale cost to the upscale individual non-point source user, and we had something like a water quality trading market that was functional. We have a couple around the country. Most of these are, let's be frank, I can do that, are dismal failures because we don't have the information. We can't really, a market's really hard to work if you don't have the demand and the supply at both ends. They become very constrained and tend not to function. The data instruments that we have now and some of these large scale systems offer the potential to actually rebuild water quality trading markets where you could get downstream, theoretically, my view, downstream fishermen in the Gulf pays a little bit to some upstream fishermen in Idaho to farmer in Idaho to reduce a little bit of nutrient pollution on the Mississippi, and that gets tracked all the way through the system. So that's kind of where we could be if we design these systems the way we need to. I'm going to put a couple questions out there for the panel then as well, and then we'll wrap up sort of for the last 10 minutes with some kind of big future-looking views. So I'm going to start with Rick. I see David did answer it, but I'm going to go ahead and see if anybody else wants to add. So Rick mentioned many discussions fail to take into account the land use and land characteristic details with comparisons of impacts, rose crop, livestock, confined feeding, open control grazing, and residential. I would say residential expansion is really critical as we look at the housing market today, and we expect what will probably be an enormous expansion in supply in the next 10 years. How can you better provide information for appropriate decision making? So David's posted some data there already. Anybody else want to speak to that issue? So how do we take into account land use?
Well, I think in Iowa, we've actually, our water is not good. I mean, that's just, everybody knows that, but we have done a pretty good job of monitoring both water quality and quantity. And, we have serious flooding here in Iowa. And so we're one of the top FEMA states for, disaster money. And so I think my sense is that, the researchers and the people in the universities feel like, the data is there. The problem we have is the policymakers, especially on the quality end of things, don't really want to acknowledge a lot of the data. And so I don't think it's so much a matter of, more strategic collection of the data as it is more strategic communication of the data to the people making policy.
Anybody else want to add a bit? I would add just a tiny bit there. So I do a lot of work with local governments. I'm really interested in bottoms up policy processes where they interact with states. And when you talk to cities, they're very, very attuned to the land use decisions driving water quality. So there are these smaller scale systems that are looking at how they can better design land use and land planning to match future water quality issues. So particularly, like I said, the folks I worked with most recently are looking at future residential growth and how to better add in some green space and some riparian buffers and natural filtration systems to deal with downstream water quality. There's no others for land use. Let's move on to another question from Rick. How do you propose to better engage the ag sector with regenerative agriculture on the land and in the political arena? Big money is resisting change to regenerative ag practices, and so small money. I'll just add to this. Agriculture generally is a small profit margin. Change is difficult everywhere. It's not just the big farms, it's also the small farms. So how do we, anybody want to talk about where they've seen systems that are starting to look at alternative agricultural systems, whether it's regenerative, more sustainability focused, or even water quality management focused?
I could probably follow up on the answer I posted. University of Minnesota is really a leader in some of this restorative or regenerative agriculture. We have a Forever Green initiative, which seeks to improve water quality, soil health, biodiversity, and climate resilience. And we're testing a lot of crops that are alternatives to the existing corn and soybean rotation. We're finding markets for these crops. So for example, General Mills is quite interested in some of them, like Hermza. And connecting farmers with markets is really important for getting these systems adopted. And I guess that's kind of the short answer.
And I would add just a bit to having grown up in the Central Valley of California, where a lot of the early sustainability certification programs had started. Data systems offer the ability to start actually reliably certifying ag products for markets that care about sustainability and care about, blue. There are some markets emerging on blue certification. So kind of beyond organic certification, but also is good for watersheds. And then of course, the sort of current sustainability markets that exist. Anybody else want to speak to it?
Well, we've had a guy at Iowa State, Matt Liebman, and I'm sure some people here have heard of him, who's been doing research on, extended rotations and integrating livestock back on a lot of these farms for, a long time, 30 years. And, he's demonstrated that farmers can, make as much money or more doing these alternative systems, which, I would call regenerative. But, we have so few farmers that want to do this in Iowa. And so, what are the issues there that are obstacles to adoption? And, these are sociological things having to do with, a lot of the land being rented. Over half the land in Iowa is rented. And then time, these regenerative systems just require more time from the farmer, more labor. And so, the dirty little secret here is that if you're just a grain farmer in Iowa, you're not working that many weeks out of the year, right? The saying is 2 weeks planting, 2 weeks spraying, 2 weeks harvesting, and then go to Scottsdale or Fort Myers. And so, how do we break out of that? This is a big question, not only for, the ag economy, but also for the environmental outcomes that we get from this system.
Yeah, I can't reiterate enough. If the data is going to be useful, it has to match the behavioral systems on the ground. There has to be a demand for it. There has to be a need for it. They're going to want to see how this makes their lives easier, not just their farms more, their farms better.
Yeah, what you said there is exactly right.
We do have the potential to do it, but these are complex systems that we have to evolve over time, where you're managing that specialized market, and they can see what that premium is for that extra bit of work that they're going to have to put in, and not go to whatever Florida spot you had mentioned before, where it's warmer and nicer than Idaho in the winter. But yeah, that's the system we're working with, right? So anybody else want to do a quick follow-up? So I'm going to skip Angela's question that was about calibration of soil erosion market models. That was answered. So I'm going to jump to some bigger picture stuff for your collective wisdom. So Calandra, I believe I pronounced that right. What data is feasible for community scale urban agriculture and green stormwater infrastructure to collect to make the case that our work is important? So I think this is thinking about data issues at the smaller scale urban systems. We tried to get a project, and I'll admit up front, I won't say what cities it was about, but linking downstream urban users to upstream agricultural users and nutrient flows and data systems, and that project failed. So let me just say there are challenges. The incentive systems are very different, but I'd like to hear what other people think about. Again, let's kind of think bigger. If we're really linking urban systems, many of these are downstream, many of these are the recipients of the upstream nutrient flows. What are the data systems that we can think about that might make those both illustrate the value and then link some of those users better than what we see being done today? And I can talk a little bit about that too if nobody else wants to, but
I can throw in with the urban things. I think it would be nice to see more monitoring data on these emerging contaminants, ranging from things like microplastics to many of the organic contaminants that are just really more exciting for people to hear about anyway. They're the things that you're worried might cause cancer, or maybe they don't, you don't really know yet. So I think those are the things that people are really interested in because of the fact that there's these question marks about their toxicity and just how much there is in your local stormwater pond, or if you are like here in the Twin Cities where you have a major river that flows through an urban area. A lot of these aren't being monitored for, and partly due to costs, I think, partly due to maybe just trying to narrow down the list of which ones you would look for. But I think especially in urban areas that would be an interest, that would be an area that where the extra data collection would be really helpful to start to get a handle on some of these emerging contaminants.
I'm spoken like a true scientist. Let me respond as a person who pays attention to the politics of pollutants and just work with the city of Las Vegas on PFAS. Those are terrifying to discuss from a water utility perspective because we don't even have a regulatory framework yet. I do think your insight is really good though, because while we don't have instrumentation for many of these yet, once we do, whether or not water agencies want to deal with the emergent pollutants, they're going to have to, because likely that instrumentation will be cheap enough to start deploying at much smaller scales. It won't be the scientists looking at it anymore, right? It'll be the activists, and it'll be the NGOs and the communities. So I think, again, that kind of idea of looking forward, what do we need to manage in the next 10, 20, 50 years? Emergent pollutants in urban areas, especially in the Southwest where I do a lot of work, those are also our water systems. So everything that washes off the streets of Las Vegas goes into the reservoir and it gets turned into the water system. So I think those are very insightful to think about what our emerging challenges are going to be on top of the ones we have not managed particularly well yet. Other comments? So community scale, urban, stormwater.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking more to maybe some of the opening comments that you made, Derek, in the sense that many of the things we try to do are reactionary and not proactive. And so, you know, urban, but by the time we know that there's a problem, we've already missed the opportunity to do something about changing it. I guess in terms of thinking about urban systems in regard to what they're receiving from their upstream neighbors that might be agricultural landscapes, you know, they're responding. I'm thinking now maybe about like Des Moines, for example, and their water treatment plant when they have to remove nitrates. You know, they're responding or they're reacting to decisions that were made by upstream landowners or renters, you know, in the prior months or even years. So I'm not sure I have a solution for that, but that I think is a challenge that further really exacerbates how we react to this.
Great. Yeah, I would add, you know, the power of urban systems is their small scale. So you can actually experiment a lot with emerging data systems. And because they're small scale, those costs are fairly low. So our cities are potentially our experiment grounds to look at these really complicated interactions. So let's move on. Climate issues have to face flooding and drought. Usually our droughts are finished with a large flood, so absolutely. Why is it soil health and regenerative agriculture being discussed and featured more? I think we've talked a little bit about the regenerative agriculture, and then Veronique has also mentioned in line with that, there are solutions out there offered that use bumblebee and hive systems to kind of get around overuse of chemicals in crops. Can folks think about these future large-scale systems and how either our future agriculture or current agriculture is likely to be able to adapt? So both consumer taste changing, maybe whether or not there's a market for this regenerative agriculture out there among consumers, but then these extreme events like flood and drought. What have you seen so far? What do you think we're going to see into the future?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of energy around these questions, Derek. As you said, consumers are really making a big impact on how the land is managed and what's grown on the land. They want more sustainably produced food. Some people are not eating as much meat. There's more of a tendency towards growing more food locally. And all of these have big benefits for, local water quality and for health of the soil. There's also a lot of interest by, major corporations to develop sustainability metrics and to source their food from farms that actually can prove that, the practices they use are sustainable and resilient. This is a very exciting time where there's a lot of change in the thinking about how landscapes are managed, and a lot of the pressure is being market driven. I think that's my basic point.
So I would say, here in Iowa, we don't have the benefit of a large metropolitan area. And so, people that live in town, yes, they do have these interests in different food systems, as Dave said there. But, the urban markets here really aren't, substantial enough to drive the farming systems that are out on the landscape. And so, like, we have 1/3 of all the hogs in the United States, and a lot of those hogs go to China. And, those people in China aren't very concerned about how sustainably those hogs are being produced. But I would say the big opportunity that's on the horizon right now is the possibility that ethanol is about to, start a death spiral. And so about 60% of our corn in Iowa goes to produce ethanol. And so 20% of our land area. So what are we going to do with that 20% of our acres, of our cropped acres? What other crops are there that farmers can produce and can produce profitably? And so a lot of people that want, better water and more and different food systems, what they don't really understand is the infrastructure that's been built, especially here around corn and soybean, and to support that specific production system. And can the infrastructure sort of adapt as ethanol, dies this slow death over the next 20 years or so?
That's great insight. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, we had a project back to the flood drought event where we try to get farmers to think about using ag land to recharge groundwater sources during flood events in the Nevada area. And the big issue was they had spent a lot of money putting in sprinkler systems to deal with drought rather than flood, and they didn't want to clog their sprinkler systems. So many farmers were walking. So there is this path dependency in this investment that we put into these agricultural systems in terms of the technology that we use.
Derek,
have,
do you
go ahead, Brett.
just to kind of follow up on that, this is a question for you. Do you what's the general understanding of like the time frames that it takes for people to respond to kind of some of these maybe larger systemic changes that you and Chris are describing? Do we know?
Yeah, it's a long discussion. Yeah, people are really good at learning, but usually after an event happens, usually more than once. So we don't learn the first time. Let's be honest, we respond, we cope, we get back to business as usual. So there are these learning pathways that we understand in systemic change. The biggest, so the work that we've done with farmers and looking at drought response, one of the biggest motivating factors out there beyond price of the crop, which Chris is talking about, that is also just federal regulatory policy. So between subsidies to agriculture that serve a purpose, but also deviation from those just means a lot of uncertainty. So it's hard to be nimble as a farmer once you reach a certain scale. So there's a lot of barriers, I think. And then the investment. I think the other thing is a lot of us don't think very honestly about the enormous investment that goes into modern agricultural production in terms of the loans they have on these tractors, in terms of tiling systems, in terms of financing for future. So whatever we're going to do, both in terms of data and looking at alternative systems, needs to take that into account completely. And then back to the idea of change. What's our theory of change? Think about what are those pivot points when you're getting ready to refinance a loan. How often do those happen? When do those occur? That's probably when those folks need information about what that future condition is going to look like, rather than what we do. We kind of flood now. We got a good study out. We flooded into them among agriculturalists. We go back and do another study. We need to think a little more carefully about those decision points, I think. We have another question from Irma. So back to urban, and this is great because this is kind of what I think the power of large-scale data systems can allow us to do. Is Chris is right. There's not big urban demand. There's no San Francisco like there is for California Central Valley farmers willing to buy local and pay premium for it to be shipped into the area in Iowa. So how do we link folks to these urban systems where the capital is, where the wealth is, who might want to see data and information systems that they can use? So Irma asked, phosphorus loads from ag sources upstream are in our urban environment. Are waste management treatment plants as required versus CWA and NPDES permits to manage CSOs and phosphorus loads, both which can be very expensive. I'm working a lot with the city of Defiance, which is facing exactly this issue. We need to be able to show that the phosphorus loads are coming from upstream and the control needs to be there. Don't want to be pointing fingers, but my guess is, again, these are rural communities driving the loading from agricultural areas. So let me see if we can do some solution-based thinking here. How might data or might systems be able to link upstream with downstream communities, and where have you seen any movement on that? Because that's really what these data systems offer the promise to do, is start doing things at scale that we've never done before.
I can speak a little bit to that. Some recent, I guess, modeling based works that I did for some watersheds in the Cedar Rapids area, Iowa. The main focus of the work was to identify conservation practices that will improve water quality, but the secondary focus was trying to quantify what are the water budget outcomes of those conservation practices. For example, cover crops, again, they take up soil moisture. Cover crops in combination with things like treatment wetlands can have measurable impacts on decreasing peak discharge for downstream sites. And so we teamed up with colleagues at the Iowa Flood Center, and they were able to put a price tag on what those avoided flood damages would be as a result of implementing conservation practices. And so it's hard to I guess connect those two upstream and downstream communities, but there are ways of putting real dollars on some of those conservation practices, and maybe people who live in downstream communities where there is more expensive infrastructure in place can recognize maybe that there is some benefit in them helping to encourage or support their upstream neighbors to implement some of those practices.
Great. I would say the downstream communities do recognize it, but we are missing the mechanisms to connect with upstream. I mean, we've tried with a couple of urban initiatives trying to link with small cities who are agricultural based, still looking at saying most of it's upstream. So we do need to work on better coordinating mechanisms, whatever that looks like. Chris, did you have a?
Yeah, I was going to say, where I think these data advances, if you will, really hold promise is this. We really need to be able to manage nutrients, but other pollution as well at the watershed scale. And by that, here in Iowa, I mean probably the Huck 8 scale, which is about 1,000 square miles here. And so when we look at the non-point source issues and then the point source things, which we do have those in Iowa, you know, if we're going to improve water quality in our streams, we need to be able to manage at the watershed scale. And so that's where these data tools can really help us, I think.
I would actually push back a little bit. I would start with that, but also the problem scale matters. So a lot of time, again, American West, the downscale users can be city of Las Vegas, and they can be many watersheds away, just because in the West we move water where we need it. So even, you know, yes, start there, because that's where you can kind of build a good conceptual, but then start looking at where that demand is. That's great, thank you. So we have another little under 10 minutes. I'm going to put one more question out there and see what people think. So this is from Angel, and this is a kind of a different perspective on it, but one that I think is very important. And then we'll ask a kind of quick roundup from folks to think about the future of water data. So is there a public communication component to the big data hub for public data dissemination? And I'll talk to anybody, I mean, anybody who kind of wants to think about the role of the public. You know, part of the data revolution that we're looking at is we expect more data now as citizens. I have a watch that tells me how many heartbeats per minute I do. I'm very frustrated that I can't get my water quality to do the same thing. Somebody's going to find that market. So, thoughts on public communication? I will say, you know, 10 years from now, I do think we will have household water quality monitoring systems that I can look at on my computer in the morning. I think down the reservoir that I go kayaking in, we'll likely be able to pull it up on my data screen and see what the water quality is. Primarily about the things I care about, which is smell when there's a drought in the area, because the sewage treatment plants are more odoriferous than normal. And we'll probably be able to get other things like temperature and other issues that we really have to dig deep right now to find. So there will be an opening of data.
This is Max Herzog from Cleveland Water Alliance. I know I'm not technically on this panel, but I think that this topic is something that's, you know, of a lot of interest right now to some of our corporate partners. And we actually have right now just wrapped up the first round of letters of intent for an innovation challenge we're running in partnership with Moen that's focused on this exact topic, detection of water quality at the tap. So I think you're absolutely right, Derek, to say that the market is moving this way, and that, you know, the primary challenges are really just getting water quality sensor cost and size down to the points that consumers want to see.
Great. Last couple of minutes. So there's a few other questions, but I'd like to open up for the panel and just talk to us about, you know, given the challenges of resilience into the future, what do you think our water data systems are going to look like if we design them right? I will do a round robin. Anybody want to jump in quickly? I think David may have to run to a meeting, or whoever needs to, and I'll finish up with whatever minutes we have. So what's the future of water data? Chris has suggested watershed scale. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think the technologies are increasing for massive collection of data at different spatial and temporal scales. USGS, you know, has a large body of data that's available nationwide that they're sharing with the public. There's another organization called Quashi that's a consortium of universities that focus on hydrological research. They have a HydroShare where they share data that's available to the public. And I think the key here is, you know, how we take this data and actually turn it into information and use it for either decision making or policy making. And the challenge is, that these massive databases could include not only water quality, but also information from the landscape that's collected for the elevations, the soils, the land use and management, the precipitation, and they're all at different scales, both spatially and temporally. So they have to be fused and sort of evaluated in a systematic way. And we're getting to the point where deep learning techniques are developing to the point that they can actually deal with spatial and temporal variability, and they can incorporate physical constraints, such as the need to balance, mass conservation. In other words, to account for the fact that you have to have a water balance. And so they're not just statistical tools anymore. They're actually process-guided machine learning tools that allow for some reasonable consideration of the physical processes that are actually controlling the hydrology and the water quality. I think that's becoming an emerging tool that's very likely to allow us to do a lot of different things with the data that we've never been able to do before.
Great, thank you.
Maybe to build off of that, we really are, I guess, we have an embarrassment of riches in terms of the data that are available. We as scientists face a lot of challenges, maybe locating and ingesting that data. But if kind of the broader discussion is thinking about how do people, or a range of people, use that data to make informed decisions about their day-to-day activities or their engagement in conservation type programs. Different users or different population groups need to get different things out of those data sets. So, if you can imagine some universal data set out there, even if all the data available were contained in one nice web platform, each individual that goes to that web platform probably only cares about a very small subset of it, and that in turn probably needs to be packaged in a way that is suitable for them to process. If you're a homeowner, you care about different things than farmers do, and you care about different things than maybe urban planners do, or golf course managers. And so I don't know, if there could be maybe dashboards that are discipline specific or something like that.
Great, thank you. We are out of time, so a couple things. We'll leave that there with kind of data sciences, data dashboards, communicating that data back out to the users. So I think it's a great way to wrap up. If there's other questions that people didn't have a chance to ask, I encourage you to reach out to our panel members. We all have email addresses. We're all easily Googled. So drop us a note. We're all happy to discuss any of these issues with anybody who was attending. Thank you, everybody, panel members. We appreciate your insights, expertise, and kind of discussion of some of the challenges and applications that are out there. And hopefully we'll have another one of these in the near future. And thank you for Cleveland Water Alliance for for herding the cats and getting us all together. Max, you have any other follow-up last minute?
Yeah, just the last thing, for folks that were interested in this conversation, as Derek said, encourage you to follow up with panelists, but also check out the upcoming sessions through Water Data Forum. Next month, on the 12th, we'll be convening a session about digital security across the water sector. And the following month, our session will be focused on innovations in remote sensing for water quality. So if you've attended this session, you'll be getting a follow-up email with this information, but we'd love to welcome you back to continue to be part of this conversation moving forward. But thanks to Derek and thanks to all the panelists today for such a great conversation.
Thank you all, and thank you, audience members.
Bye now.
Thank you.